Hello there, you're watching All 24 News live from Algiers. Let's check out the headlines. Kevin McCarthy has been elected Speaker of the House of Representatives in the U.S. after heated exchanges which almost saw fellow Republicans come to blows. Also coming up, despite the ceasefire, exchanges of artillery shells were reported along Ukraine's front lines with Russia. And in our news as well, violence erupted in Mexico, leaving 30 dead after the arrest of a drug cartel leader. Hello again and welcome to the program Fast in Our News. According to President Mahmoud Abbas' spokesman Nabil Abu Rodaini, the measures announced by the Zionist occupation government in response to Palestine's action at the UN are decried and rejected. The president's spokesperson urged the international community to act right away to stop these Zionist threats, which run counter to all legitimately adopted international agreements under the leadership of the U.S. administration. In some of its first acts since coming to power, Zionist entity's new security cabinet approved a series of punitive steps against the Palestinian leadership. The move is in retaliation for Palestinians pushing the UN's highest judicial body to give its opinion on the Zionist occupation. The development underscores the hardline approach to the Palestinians that the Zionist entity's new ultra-nationalist government has promised at a time of rising violence in the occupied territories. The move comes just after the security leader of the Zionist entity provoked the Palestinians and international community supporting Palestine to condemn such acts.
What red line does Israel need to cross for the Security Council to finally say enough is enough and to act accordingly? When are you going to act? Even after worldwide outrage and condemnation, it has displayed utter disregard for the sanctity of Palestinian life, the sanctity of international law, and the sanctity of Al-Haram al-Sharif. It does so with absolute contempt.
A few weeks after the revelation of a vast corruption scandal by foreign states within the European Parliament, investigation reveals the involvement of Morocco. According to Belgian media NOG and The Evening, Mr. Panzeri is said to have linked himself to the General Directorate of Studies and Documentation, the Foreign Intelligence Service of Morocco, and to have received money and products from this country through a diplomat currently posted in Poland. Morocco has not officially commented on the allegations, but on Thursday, its foreign minister has complained of European Parliament harassment. To Western Sahara now, under the supervision of the Preparatory Committee for the 16th Congress of the Polisario Front, committees emanating from the National Preparatory Symposium began their work in order to unify the perception and visions on all issues discussed in the local seminars. The three subcommittees, the Basic Law Committee, the National Action Program Committee, and the Letters and Recommendation Committee, will continue their work within 2 days to present it to the Congress. Algeria energy company Sonatrach CEO Tawfiq Hakar confirmed that Sonatrach supplied more than 4 billion cubic meters of natural gas on an immediate basis to its European customer during the past year, in addition to those contracted. Mr. Hakar also revealed the allocation of $40 billion to increase the country's production of oil and gas over a period of 5 years. To neighboring Libya now, the Libyan State's High Council Chairman, Mr. Khaled al-Mashri, revealed the continuation of the dispute between the House of Representatives and the Supreme Council of the state regarding the conditions for the candidacy of the presidential elections contained in the constitutional rule leading to the Libyan Fund perhaps the most prominent of which relates to the candidacy of dual nationals for the expected presidential election, as well as their desire to complete the rest of the other electoral laws, that they are concerned about some problems such as the distribution of seats. In Africa still, Mali's military leader has pardoned 49 soldiers from neighboring Ivory Coast who were arrested in July and accused of being mercenaries, the Malian presidency said in a statement. Sofiane Kenturi with more details.
Mali's military leader on Friday pardoned 49 soldiers from neighboring Ivory Coast who were convicted of undermining Mali's state security and conspiracy against the government. Ivory Coast, in their defense, said the soldiers were part of the United Nations peacekeeping mission in Mali and were contracted to work for a private company contracted by the UN. Thus, the soldiers' arrest and charge against them sparked a diplomatic dispute between Mali and Ivory Coast.
His Excellency Assimi Goïta, President of the Transition, Head of State, granted his pardon with full remission of sentences to the 49 Ivorians convicted by the Malian courts for the following offenses.
The pardon comes 1 week after 46 of soldiers were sentenced to 20 years in prison. The 3 others defendants, all women, who had been released in September, were tried in absentia and sentenced to death.
In this circumstance, the government of the transition and the Malian people thank His Excellency Colonel Assimi Goïta, President of the Transition and Head of State, for this gesture, which once again demonstrates his attachment to peace.
The statement on Friday announcing the pardon described the move as an independent decision, symbolizing the president's commitment to good governance and preserving fraternal relations with countries in the region, particularly Ivory Coast. It didn't specify when the soldiers would leave prison.
In Africa still, people in Benin are heading to polls on Sunday, January 8th, to choose their representatives in the National Assembly. Legislative elections have seen for the first time in a long period as 3 out of the 7 parties of the country are claiming to take part of opposition. Here's Osama Ayadi with the details.
The legislative elections campaign in Benin closed at midnight on Friday, as the elections slated for the 8th of January 2023 are witnessing high tide. Many new younger faces have risen in the 15-day campaign to convince over 6 million voters in the country. Unlike the previous elections which took place in 2019, 3 out of 7 parties have claimed to be part of opposition and expressed their will to compete for the 109 seats of the National Assembly.
The life of every human being. The future of any country depends on the life of brotherhood within the citizens of this country. This imposes on us to leave everything away, every division, and every situation of a crisis.
Many challenges resurfaced at the political scene of Benin. What hasn't been clear for the citizens and leaders of the country is the number of voters, especially that a big number of citizens expressed unwillingness to take part in the ballot. These elections are considered a test for the country's democracy and political awareness. The previous elections of 2019 had seen a wave of violence through many regions of the country. The hope for this year's elections is to avoid the mistakes of the previous era, especially that voters will be able to show their support for the fresh opposition parties.
With the introduction of the opposition parties, in addition to those of the majority, we are now faced with the competition which promises to be more or less open. This therefore means that, if only for the opposition deputies, they absolutely must have the 10% to sit.
As for the security level, Benin has been under the threat of terrorism, especially after the rise of terrorist organizations linked to Al-Qaeda in the Sahel region, starting from the year 2012.
Hundreds of Houthi supporters marched along the streets of Yemen's capital on Friday in protest against the Saudi-led coalition's blockade of the country. Demonstrators gathered near the city's university and were seen holding banners with images of Shiite leaders, including those of Houthi leader Abdul Malik al-Houthi, Qasem Soleimani, a former leading commander of Iran's Revolutionary Guard, and Hassan Nasrallah, leader of Lebanon's Hezbollah.
The Yemeni leadership has multiple choices. Either the countries of tyranny, injustice, arrogance over the Yemeni people lift the blockade, and the injustice and tyranny of air forces, the multiple and various wars, or the Yemeni people have prepared themselves and are ready for all choices they want, either war or peace without a blockade or any dictates at all.
Moving on to the U.S. now. After days of deadlock and a series of embarrassing defeats, Kevin McCarthy finally secured election as the 53rd Speaker of the House on the 15th ballot, overcoming holdouts from his own ranks and floored tensions boiling over after a chaotic week that tested the new GOP majority's ability to govern. As the House resumed for the late-night session, McCarthy had been close to win in the 14th round, but he fell one vote short. President Joe Biden on Friday marked the second anniversary of the U.S. Capitol attack with an award ceremony for those who battled to defend America's democracy against attackers he said were, quote, fueled by lies about the 2020 presidential election. Biden, a Democrat, awarded the Presidential Citizens Medal to 14 people, some of them posthumously, and gave remarks in a White House ceremony, while Republicans, many of them loyal to former President Donald Trump, struggled for a fourth straight day to elect a Speaker of the House of Representatives. A new U.S. weapons and package, or aid package, for Ukraine worth more than $3 billion was announced, including Sea Sparrow missiles for air defense and Bradley fighting vehicles. The Sea Sparrow missiles will help curb Russian missile strikes on Ukraine, which are intended to exhaust Kiev's air defenses and damage the country's energy infrastructure.
My dear senators, welcome. First of all, you're very welcome to Ukraine. Thank you very much for everything. I think today I can say it very honestly and openly.
With the Russia-Ukraine file still, shellfire echoed on Saturday around the streets of the Ukrainian town of Bakhmut, the current focus of the most intense fighting in Russia's war of Ukraine. Russia's defense ministry said on Saturday its forces in Ukraine would maintain a ceasefire. It unilaterally, declared in honor of Orthodox Christmas until midnight, despite Ukraine rejecting the truce offer. Russia says its troops had only returned artillery fire when fired upon by Ukrainian forces, whom it accused of shelling civilian areas.
The Russian troops have been honoring a ceasefire along the entire line of contact in the area of the special military operation since 12 Moscow time on January 6th. Meanwhile, Kyiv regime has continued to shell civilian areas and Russian positions with artillery over the past 24 hours. Russian forces have returned fire from positions of Ukrainian forces from which the shelling was taking place and suppressed them.
Residents in Culiacan in Mexico woke up Friday to streets filled with burnt-out vehicles and looted shops after an organized criminal group stormed the city after the detention of Ovidio Guzman, the son of imprisoned drug lord Joaquin El Chapo Guzman. Islam Sid reports.
Thousands of soldiers took control of the city of Culiacan and its surroundings after it turned into a war zone following the capture of El Chapo's son. The operation has witnessed a land and air massive fire exchange between the army and the cartels all the way to the airport, which has killed 29 people, including 11 from law enforcement. 35 other soldiers were wounded by the gunfire, while 21 people were arrested during this operation. However, no civilians were among the casualties.
The Attorney General's office had 20 detainees for crimes such as theft against businesses. All the detainees are male and were detained by elements of the investigation police.
Guzman was charged by the United States on drug trafficking charges in 2018. In 2019, he was briefly detained in Mexico and then released after violence erupted following his arrest. His capture comes 3 days before the arrival of U.S. President Joe Biden in Mexico.
We guarantee you that we will be taking care of security. We already are. You can already live in normal conditions.
The Sinaloa cartel leader is considered by the American DEA as a wanted man for trafficking cocaine, methamphetamine, and marijuana in the United States. According to both countries' officials, he assumed a growing role among his brothers in carrying on their father's business.
I think that Mexico, wants to do at least the bare minimum in terms of counter drug efforts. And I think that it shows that, you know, they're trying to do something that is minimal. But, you know, one of the things that they haven't done is they haven't confronted the cartels.
Ovidio Guzman was transferred from an Air Force aircraft to El Altiplano prison, 90 kilometers from Mexico City. It was from the same prison that his father escaped in 2015 by using a long tunnel dug under his cell.
In Latin America, still Peruvians again took to the streets for the fourth day, blocking roads across the country to demand the resignation of President Dina Boluarte, who took over from her ousted predecessor Pedro Castillo in December. Here's Zahra Farjani.
Since Wednesday, mass protests and roadblocks have taken place daily across Peru. Beyond the initial demands for the resignations of the Dina Boluarte's administration, the shutdown of Congress, and general elections, protesters are increasingly advancing social demands over the high cost of living and staggering social inequality.
Right now, I don't have anything to eat. We're not working. My wife and children could be at home. But no, we're fighting for a cause, not for me, but for the rest, for everyone. There are some people insulting us. They say we are terrorists, idlers, slackers, but no, we're fighting for all of them.
Right-wingers have ousted from government our President Pedro Castillo Terrones. The Peruvian Congress ousted him. The Peruvian people don't want that Congress. We don't want newly appointed President Dina Boluarte, and we want her immediate resignation, the Congress closing, and a new constitution.
Peru's protests began in early December after President Castillo was removed from office and then detained after illegally trying to dissolve Congress. His successor Boluarte, who took office on December 7th, has vowed to lead a transition government that will call for early elections which still need a ratification vote from Congress.
Since day one, I have given firm and concrete signs of creating a clean government based on merit as well as honesty. I have sworn in ministers under the commitment of not falling into corruption and sworn to restructure the presidential office.
In the midst of this social unrest, the political crisis escalates in parallel in the country. The prosecutor's office announced this Friday that it will carry out preliminary proceedings on the complaints filed against President Boluarte and 3 of her ministers.
Countries in the world, including all European states, required a pre-flight testing along with the wearing of face masks for passengers coming from China, as an effort to protect their population from COVID outbreak, which sparked fears that China may transmit the new variant of the virus and boost rates of infections across the world. The recommendations come as China dropped its travel restrictions after nearly 3 years amid high COVID-19 outbreak in the country.
In light of the European recommendations, the Belgian government decided to test the wastewater from planes arriving from China. That's why Brussels Airport has coordinated with the different parties involved. The airline, of course, Avia partner The Handler, but also SPF, Saint Public and Saniport, to enable this new procedure to be put in place.
In China still, hundreds of millions in China on Saturday started returning to their hometowns ahead of the Lunar New Year period. However, the country is seeking to minimize the possibility of a major new COVID-19 outbreak. The huge mass migration is taking place amid a surging wave of infections across the country that has overwhelmed hospitals, emptied pharmacies of medicines, and caused international alarm.
We encourage people to make travel plans based on the situation of themselves and family members, in particular the elderly with underlying diseases and the families with pregnant women, infants and children should try to reduce travel as much as possible to avoid the infectious risk during travel.
For more stories making headlines around the globe, here's the news in brief.
Bridge damage at Fitzroy Crossing, Western Australia, after the area suffered from record-breaking floods. The bridge was submerged and people were evacuated at Fitzroy Crossing
Thousands of Kurdish people living in France marched in the streets of Paris on Saturday to mark the 10th anniversary of the killing of 3 Kurdish women activists in the French capital. The investigation of the Paris attack in January 2013 was dropped after the main suspect died shortly before coming to trial.
A 6-year-old student shot and wounded a teacher on Friday during an altercation inside a first-grade classroom at Rich Neck Elementary School in Newport News, Virginia, which police said was not accidental. No students were wounded. There was no further explanation for how the child acquired the handgun. According to police, the teacher suffered life-threatening injuries.
The UN rights chief called on Saturday on the transitional authorities and terrorist-hit Burkina Faso to swiftly and transparently probe the killing of 28 people whose bodies were found last weekend. Volker Turk welcomed that authorities had said they would investigate after the bodies were discovered in the northwest of the country.
Jack Ma, the founder of Ant Group, will give up control of the Chinese fintech giant as part of restructuring intended to put an end to the regulatory onslaught that began soon after Ant Group's enormous public market launch was derailed 2 years ago. When Ant's $37 billion IPO, which would have been the biggest in history, was abruptly postponed in November 2020, the financial technology company was forced to restructure, and rumors had it that the Chinese billionaire would have to give up control. And finally, in our news, after a 3-year break due to the pandemic, South Korea's annual ice fishing festival made an impressive comeback on Saturday with a massive turnout of about 129,000 people who braved below freezing temperatures for a chance to catch trout fish on a frozen lake. Participants in the festival held in Hwacheon, 120 kilometers north of the capital Seoul in the northern province of Gangwon, dig a small hole through the thick ice on the frozen lake to catch the fish, while others choose to jump into a pool of freezing waters to catch the trout fish with their bare hands.
The thickness of this ice is 36 centimeters. We got no problem with it. We have a police office, a fire station, a medical team here, just in case for possible incidents. We also mobilize a disaster response team that can dive in the water and check on the safety of the ice.
Oh well, we reached the end of our news bulletin. For more stories, you can visit our social media platforms. That's it for me. Take care.